The Hollow Signal. In the late autumn of 1987, a small town called Black Hollow, nestled in the dense pine forests of northern Maine, began to unravel. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines, population barely scraping 600, a single gas station, a diner called Millie's, and a tangle of dirt roads that wound through the trees like veins. People kept to themselves, and the thick fog that rolled in from the nearby lake every evening gave the town an air of perpetual isolation. But that fall, something changed. It started with the radio. Tom Carver, a wiry man in his late 30s who worked as a mechanic, was the first to notice it. He'd been tinkering with an old Chevy in his garage late one night, the clock ticking past midnight, when his battered AM radio, always tuned to the local station, WBLH, crackled to life with something strange. The station usually played a mix of country tunes and weather updates, but that night, the music cut out abruptly, replaced by a low, droning hum. It wasn't static, it was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like a heartbeat pulsing through the speakers. Then came the voice. "They're watching from the hollow," it whispered, soft and raspy, as if spoken through a throat clogged with dust. "Don't look outside." Tom froze, wrench still in hand, and stared at the radio. The voice didn't repeat itself. After a long stretch of silence, the hum faded, and the station kicked back into a Johnny Cash song mid-chorus, as if nothing had happened. He chalked it up to a prank, maybe some kids messing with the signal, and went to bed, though he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him like damp air. The next morning at Millie's diner, Tom mentioned it casually over coffee. The regulars, old men in flannel and trucker hats, laughed it off. "Probably just Ed down at WBLH falling asleep on the job again," one of them said. Ed Haskell, the station's lone DJ, was known for nodding off during late-night shifts, letting dead air fill the waves. But when Tom drove by the station later that day, intending to rib Ed about it, he found the building dark. The neon on-air sign flickered weakly, and Ed's truck wasn't in the lot. Tom didn't think much of it. Ed could have been out sick, but it gnawed at him. That night, the hum came back. Tom was in his living room this time, flipping through a hunting magazine, when the radio on the shelf sputtered and died, then revived with that same low pulse. "They're closer now," the voice hissed. "Lock your doors." Tom's stomach lurched. He crossed the room in 2 strides, and yanked the plug from the wall. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind rattling the pines outside. He peered through the curtains, half expecting to see someone, or something, staring back from the fog-shrouded yard. Nothing but shadows. By the end of the week, others in Black Hollow started hearing it too. At first, it was just a handful of folks, widowed Mrs. Delaney, who swore the voice told her, "They see you through the glass," and Pete Grayson, a logger who claimed it whispered, "The trees aren't empty." Word spread fast, as it does in small towns, and soon Millie's was buzzing with nervous chatter. Theories ranged from a Soviet broadcast experiment to a haunted radio tower. A few tried calling WBLH, but the line just rang endlessly. Ed still hadn't turned up, and when Sheriff Danvers finally checked the station, he found it abandoned, records scattered across the floor, a half-eaten sandwich molding on the desk, and the transmitter running on a loop of static. Then the disappearances started. It was little Ellie Harper who vanished first, a 6-year-old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. She'd been playing in her backyard one evening, her mother inside washing dishes, when the screaming stopped. Mrs. Harper ran out to find the swing still swaying, Ellie's teddy bear face down in the dirt, and no sign of her daughter. The fog was thick that night, so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, and the search party combing the woods found nothing but a faint hum in the air, like the one from the radio, but coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. 2 days later, Pete Grayson didn't come home from his logging shift. His crew said he'd been jittery all day, muttering about shadows moving between the trees. They found his axe embedded in a stump, the blade slick with something dark and sticky, but no Pete. By then, the town was on edge. People stopped going out after dark. Radios were unplugged or smashed, Some swore they heard the hum even without them, leaking from the walls, the floorboards, the air itself. Tom couldn't sleep. Every creak of his old house set his nerves alight. He'd taken to sitting up with his shotgun across his lap, staring at the windows. On the seventh night since the first broadcast, he heard it again, not from the radio, but from outside. A low, throbbing hum, vibrating through the glass. He gripped the gun tighter and edged toward the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The fog pressed against the house like a living thing, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns. And then he saw it, or thought he did. A shape, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the yard where the trees began. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, its edges blurred by the mist. Tom's breath caught, and the hum grew louder, drilling into his skull. He stumbled back, heart hammering, and when he looked again, it was gone. The next morning, he went to Sheriff Danvers. The sheriff, a grizzled man with tired eyes, listened without interrupting, then sighed. "You're the fifth person this week to say they saw something in the fog. I don't know what's going on, Tom, but I'm running out of places to look for answers." He showed Tom a map pinned to the wall, dotted with red marks, every spot where someone had disappeared or seen something strange. They formed a loose circle around the old radio tower on the outskirts of town, a rusted relic from the 50s that WBLH still used. That night, Tom convinced Danvers and a few others, Mike from the gas station and Clara, a tough-as-nails bartender, to check the tower. Armed with flashlights, rifles, and a gnawing sense of dread, they drove out in Danvers' pickup. The fog was thicker than ever, swallowing the headlights, and the hum was inescapable now, a constant thrum that set their teeth on edge. The tower loomed ahead, its skeletal frame barely visible until they were right on it. The base was surrounded by a chain-link fence, the gate hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. Inside the small control shack at the tower's base, they found chaos. Wires spilled from gutted panels, papers littered the floor, and a faint red light pulsed from the transmitter. On the desk sat a logbook, its pages filled with Ed Haskell's shaky handwriting. The last entry, dated a week ago, read, "It's in the signal. They're using it to find us. I can't stop it." Below that, scrawled in a frantic hand, "Don't listen." Before they could process it, the hum spiked, so loud it drove them to their knees. The red light flared, and the air grew heavy, like it was pressing down on them. Clara screamed, pointing at the window. Outside, in the fog, shapes were moving, dozens of them, tall and thin, gliding silently toward the shack. Their forms were wrong, too long, too jagged, like shadows stretched past breaking. Tom fired his shotgun through the glass, the blast swallowed by the hum, and the figures didn't flinch. "Get to the truck!" Danvers yelled, but it was too late. The door burst open, and the fog poured in, thick and cold, carrying the shapes with it. Mike swung his rifle, but something grabbed him, yanking him into the mist, with a wet, tearing sound. Clara bolted for the back exit, only to freeze as the hum became a voice, low, guttural, speaking words none of them could understand. She clawed at her ears, blood trickling between her fingers, before collapsing. Tom and Danvers ran, stumbling through the fog, the tower's red light pulsing behind them. They made it to the truck, engine roaring to life, and peeled out onto the road. The shapes didn't follow, or maybe they didn't need to. The hum stayed with them, burrowing into their minds. Danvers dropped Tom off at his house, muttering about getting state police, but his eyes were wild, unfocused. Tom never saw him again. By morning, Black Hollow was a ghost town. Houses stood empty, cars idled in driveways with no drivers, and the fog hung low and still. Tom packed a bag and left, driving south until the hum faded from his ears. He never went back. Years later, he heard the official story, a gas leak, mass hysteria, a town abandoned overnight. But he knew better. The signal had found them, and whatever it called was still out there, waiting in the hollow.